Hi everyone, welcome to another pod. Delighted today to have Angus Walker joining us from Hong Kong. Angus can give a quick introduction, but he's worked as an investor in public and private for quite some time now. Some pretty interesting perspectives, given that he's living in Asia and has had a bit of experience in these markets that are now so topical. So welcome, Angus.
Thank you very much, Raz. What do they say? Long time listener, first time caller. Thank you. So yeah, no, a quick background. As you can probably tell, an Aussie, been up in Hong Kong for the last 10 years, and one of those kind of sickos who kind of picked up the investment bug very early, and have kind of, it's kind of the first thing I think about, last thing I go to bed. But really enjoyed the journey so far, and still relatively early, but I learnt a lot and have the scars to show for some, but equally, now feel very comfortable. Kind of found our niche of what works and what doesn't.
Yep, perfect. So this was a pretty interesting week. It seems like it's been a while since we had earnings. But in some ways, it was almost the first crack in the chip maker facade, in the sense that three companies reported earnings that I think are particularly relevant. It was ASML, Taiwan Semiconductor, and Alphawave, which I don't think many people would be familiar with. But I know it's one of your favorite picks. Are you happy to explain Alphawave and
Yeah, it
why
is.
you
It
like
is.
it?
And look, I think if you liked it a lot last week, you'll like it even more this week because it's about 20 or 30% cheaper, is the old adage. The Alpha Wave, I think, in my mind, is one of just these really great ways to play the whole AI thematic without paying, 50 for a company, and arguably, growing quicker. So, this is the company which is, having spent a lot of time in the semiconductor space, is one of those more downstream kind of players, but, a business which has really kind of robust kind of, uh, moats around it, where, really stickiness around its IP. So it's more similar to like an ARM style business where their semiconductor licensing IP is what kind of customers come to. And it's a company that actually listed over in London, which I think, with the benefit of hindsight, wouldn't have been the best call because the expectations that were there that ARM were also going to list there. To have your largest peer listed in the same market's usually a good thing. Obviously, SoftBank kind of saw the dollar signs and went straight to the Nasdaq, so that didn't quite play out. But as they listed, they're a really interesting business. They specialize in really high speed kind of connectivity between chips. And so if you've read about the kind of chiplet design structures, AMD's kind of core architecture, this is a really kind of like similar kind of IP business. Um, you've got to kind of first ask yourself why are we getting presented such a lovely opportunity at kind of single digit multiples, and when they listed, they were kind of 50% plus of their revenue coming from China. You know, almost immediately upon listing, US started ratcheting up those kind of tariffs and so on the business, which really kind of sent people scared. The other kind of like key pieces about it was, unfortunately, they missed two audits in a row, which is basically, like, I think for many, just red flag, red flag. I think, digging into the actual nuance of it, they were really explainable kind of misses. The first was kind of a backlog of COVID, just where KPMG couldn't get, about, I think it was 20 or 30% of the index reported their earnings late, and were given, everyone was kind of given grace for that. So when year two kind of comes around, I think people are less forgiving, and that was, really came down to them acquiring two businesses in, I think, the third and fourth quarter of that year. And these are deep kind of high intangible kind of acquisitions, so not necessarily revenue generating immediately. And I think the auditor just really took a long time to get their head around such acquisitions. Ultimately, everything kind of cleared out and was resolved. Nothing untoward. But ultimately, I think what's created a really kind of interesting opportunity now, because it feels like it's really missed this whole semiconductor run. Um, and I think when you think even about ARM, they're more of a legacy business where they've been in the game for a long time. So much of their book is around this 28 nanometer, pretty unsexy consumer electronics business, where Alphawave is playing and specializes is 7 nanometer and below. And if you look at today's kind of bookings wins, it's really 5 nanometer, 3 nanometer, and even in the last announcement, they've spoken to 2 nanometer, which who knows how far that's off, but that they'll be there, and they've got a lot of patents around that technology. So I think one of the great trends, and I think defensively, if you think about buying something like an NVIDIA or an AMD, which I think you're seeing more of these large hyperscalers, your Amazons, your Googles, and your Microsoft clouds over time they're looking to really bring in-house, a lot of these chip designs, and they're never going to have a high-speed connectivity division, but they'll outsource to people like an Alphawave. So this shift of chips internally, I think, becomes a really interesting kind of tailwind for them as well. Google's been doing it for years with kind of TensorFlow TPUs, but we've seen AMD and Microsoft partner on their own cloud chips and things like that. So I think that's going to be a really interesting kind of thematic that plays out. But ultimately, it's still early in its journey. It's got a lot of kind of large customer wins, and the bookings, continue to beat. That ultimately points to like a pipeline in 2025 where you really get the revenue kind of inflection. So I mean, this is a company, just to put some numbers around it, that is targeting 450 million now. It was 500 last week, but they've effectively closed their China business, which actually I think is a really helpful, what was considered a huge drag for it anyway. I'd
So this
effectively
is
kind
what,
of written it
sorry to
off.
jump in. So this is what caused that 30% drop, was it?
Yeah, exactly.
China
So I mean,
business.
yeah, I mean, what they basically did was went to a bunch of customers in there and basically said, look, we're going to normalize. It was lower margin kind of revenue anyway. They were going to normalize the business in terms of lifting prices. They kind of offered them all the new pricing structure. Most just said no, and that was kind of a bit of a, well, we're a bit indifferent anyway. So they just exited that. So in my mind, just kind of brought forward the ramp down of the China side. And ultimately these days in semiconductors and working with the large OEMs, you really have to pick a side, unfortunately, on the whole which side of the fence you sit on.
Right. So this is a £1 billion company, and they're targeting 450 mil US
Yeah,
of
450
revenue.
mil US revenue. They'll do probably 20% EBITDA margins at the low end of their guidance there. So, call it 90 in EBITDA 2024. And that's kind of, underpins today's val, because you're trading at less than, or around 10 times EBITDA. And that looks pretty good. I think we see kind of, and they've guided to $1 billion of revenue only by 2027, which you kind of got to remind yourself is only 3 years away too. So,
Very
that'll
scary.
be, yeah. And the other thing they did, I'd say, which got punished for, was two of those acquisitions. They've become a more vertically integrated business, so they're now going down fully into the custom silicon. Without getting too much into the weeds, it's just a lower margin business, much better for their end customers, because you can do more of a kind of turnkey solution on a whole process. But it just meant that their EBITDA went from 50% kind of margins down to 20 now, but they expect that to recover actually into the 30s again by 27.
Right. So roughly one-time sales on the 2027 target with a 20% margin.
Yeah, and look, three times EBITDA at that level. They're targeting 35% EBITDA margins, so
Right.
350 mil on a billion. That's less than three times today's market cap. So when you've got peers trading at 80 times, I don't think that's the right multiple either. But this just feels like a really good defensive way to play with AI, but it's dancing in the AI space, but close to the door in case it
Mm.
does kind of roll back. So things like this week I see is like a really great buying opportunity. And you don't want to make careers out of like running into a burning house. But I think if you understand the nuances of what they're doing, I'm more excited about the stuff which isn't even being produced today, which is going to be the real revenue driver in 2 and 3 years time.
Mm. And so who are the customers that are going to drive that? Are we talking
So
Amazon? Are we talking?
yeah, so Amazon has, I mean, they never name them publicly, but, listening to enough of the earnings calls, and, there's only really three kind of hyperscalers that you can refer to, and you kind of get a sense of who it is. So Amazon's definitely one of their big customers. Just this quarter, they've announced their first direct relationship with one of the world's largest automakers. So, whether that's a, GM or whoever, I doubt it's a Tesla, but, it could be anyone. You don't get a great visibility on their end customers, but ultimately they're the tier ones of the world.
Right.
I think
And
actually one other thing I think is important is the founder himself as well has been in the industry for 30 years, well known by basically all the participants. He's exited his last two businesses to Intel, and I think it was Qualcomm for the second. And I think he doesn't pay himself a large salary, but up to his gills in stocks. So that's always kind of like a good sign of how he's going to get remunerated as well.
right. Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, one of my concerns is you get in the weeds in something like semiconductors where there's this huge wave of investment coming, probably the biggest capex build out in history. Um, a worry I have is you get tied up. You try and be a bit too clever, go for small caps, when really it's kind of NVIDIA, Taiwan Semiconductor, a handful of companies that will just end up capturing all of that, and with the strongest negotiating power. And they'll generally they might miss earnings every now and then. There'll be big swings, but nothing like what you'll see in small caps.
Yeah, and you know what? That's been the last 3 or 4 years. It's been looking you in the face. It has been the Magnificent Seven that have done, the legwork of all the index gains. But I think, ultimately as well, there's you and I'd probably much rather come up against less covered stocks with more retail or whatever it is. Create those kind of David Goliath mismatches as much as possible. And I think NVIDIA still actually does look cheap here to me if you actually are willing to forecast it out more than 3 years, and looks cheaper than most of other semiconductor players. So I think actually that's a great buy too. It's kind of how do you pad it around the edges too. So I don't think it's you only buy one.
Yeah. But I think it's interesting, like, NVIDIA's trading, say, 27 times forward PE, but the one that sticks out to me as being particularly overvalued is ARM. I mean, that thing's trading astonishingly high. It's not growing somehow. I mean, they're
Well,
involved.
it's
They are
yeah.
involved in NVIDIA's next generation, so there's a bit of excitement around that. But it's way ahead of
I
everybody
think
else.
I
Without,
think it's I think it's changed since
that is the 100 times
yeah.
PE. That one is 100 times PE.
And I think it's changed since the IPO, but it's 70% of their book is actually very legacy old kind of stuff that's, royalty businesses, once they start producing the chips, they basically clip the ticket every time. But so much of its backlog is actually old world kind of stuff. So there's a new sexy part, but it's a very small part of their business today. So I totally agree. I think that kind of comes down to SoftBank still owning, 90% of the business. So, really tight free float. I think it's like, you know, it was such an obvious short, and I would have like burnt. I unfortunately don't short stocks, but you probably would have burnt 50% upside because it just continued to rip, and it was almost two consensus a short. So I think still that comes down, but who knows on what time frame.
Yeah. I feel like after that kind of 100% rip after last earnings, that was probably the moment to short
Yeah,
if you were
that
doing
was
that kind
it.
of thing.
You just
And it's a pretty good
broke
pair.
everyone else. Yeah,
Yeah, go long NVIDIA and short ARM at 5 times the multiple with none of the growth. That the only exciting thing about it is its relationship with NVIDIA.
that's it. And you've probably got an eventual seller in ARM as well, in SoftBank as well, right?
SoftBank.
They're not natural owners of 90% of the company, so definitely more to come.
Yeah, there was another one. So ASML reported, and they kind of, or they missed, particularly on orders. I think spooked the market, but it's kind of a weird one because they had such a blowout orders last quarter. It went from 3 to 9 billion or something. It was a huge outlier in terms of the order book. So these are very lumpy purchases. So it's quite likely that a lot of that was brought forward in that quarter. And they're still maintaining their guidance. So they're still forecasting a pretty blowout back end of the year. That could change, but I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah, I think you touched on the big piece. It's like, these ASML sells in single units. I mean, it's not whether you sold, 10,000 or 20,000. It's kind of like, did they sell 42 or 44 of these kind of machines in a given quarter? So super lumpy whether one of those kind of comes in and lands on a day. I mean, things like talking to other people in business, that actually a pet food company here in Hong Kong, who's just a friend, he's been massively delayed through these kind of canal issues through the Middle East. So, things like that, if you get into the weeds of actual revenue recognition, could really play out for a company like that. Ultimately, spend a bit of time talking to them. It's a really supply constrained business. They sell as much as they can produce. And, but it means because the componentry is so niche, one, you can only move as fast as your slowest component, kind of like the Tesla issue from about, 4 years ago. But, one little kind of producer that can't bring this tiny little, one of their contractors literally just helps them turn over the semiconductor extremely precisely from one side to the other. If they kind of hit headwinds or something like that, the whole shebang comes to a bit of a grinding halt. So
Yeah.
yeah,
The other thing
yeah,
I noticed in their last report, it's probably because sales were down, but the proportion that went to China was particularly large, was 49%. And this is in the context of them not even being able to sell their high-end equipment to the Chinese. But I just think it's just like this massive policy-owned goal by the West, particularly the United States, to kind of kneecap these companies and foster, the Chinese going to react, right? They're obviously spending enormous state resources trying to recreate ASML and all the other companies in
Totally.
the supply chain.
And they've just brought that forward so far. Like, I mean, it's such a known goal. I think so defensive. And the best thing they could have done is just fostered more development at home and just created a massive lead. But I think by the time, there was such a reliance on these companies, and what China's definitely realized is that you've got to pull that forward, and we need all that capability in house. And they'll get there, trying to kind of get a roadmap, and they actually hit the targets. Like you look at their space exploration, it's boom, boom, boom. They can actually they take really long-term views on this stuff, which is, one of the shortcomings of kind of Western democracy is that you kind of got, election cycles, so you don't really care too much about getting past those pieces. These guys are thinking in kind of multi-decade, time frames. So they've let out the tiger, I think. So, in a few years' time, it's going to be really interesting to see where the balance of power sits on semis.
Yeah, definitely. It was a bit of a crack, though. It was the first kind of crack that was not consistent with the thesis of immense demand.
As you know, we've looked at this though, right, together. It's if you look at somebody like Microsoft, and I forget the headline numbers, but how many data centers they're looking to build by 2028. What do you remember what that was? Is it 800 or
Yeah, so this is just one source working at Microsoft who is involved in these decisions. So they've got 192 data centers now. They're refitting them all out, or many of them out, and they're targeting 800 by 2028. So fourfold increase.
yeah,
Well over 100 a year. And their prior plan only a few years ago was to build 100 over a decade. So it's almost like a tenfold increase in a few years.
yeah, you just go, what am I doing buying Alphawave? Just buy NVIDIA.
But it's Taiwan Semi, it's the index, it's the whole thing. But yeah, I
Yeah,
think
it is.
I guess in the price cycles there were those smaller or rather mid cap people who owned the niche, like KLA, and there are a couple of niche performers that did
Yeah,
exceptionally well.
the KLAs, like the duopolies, like they are really defensive and robust. I mean, there's a lot of know-how that sits inside these businesses, and they are important cogs and pretty invaluable. So if you can find those that I think AMD actually made a really important acquisition a few years back of Xilinx. And this was a company like 80 to 90% market share in the kind of laser kind of technology that they used. I mean, these are kind of still really interesting ways to play it. And when back to the Alphawave piece, and then I'll stop. But they were like TSMC's top high speed connectivity partner for 3 years running. Work directly inside the kind of sandbox there, and so have a real front run. So they're the kind of pieces you definitely want to see. You don't want to kind of rely on somebody out competing the other.
Yeah. Well, Taiwan Semiconductor reported yesterday as well. So that was kind of an interesting, and that beat on income and revenue. Shares were down about 5%, but I think it's partly in the context of a huge rally up to it. But it does kind of give you a sense of where the positioning is. Everyone on podcasts is talking about semis.
Yeah,
It's just one of those things where it's gone to like everybody has to own, everybody has an opinion, everybody's learned about all these companies, everybody's read that book, Chip War. It's just that moment
totally,
where
totally.
it's gone
Every,
from everybody
and
writing them
everyone's
off
stocking.
to
Yeah. No, I think
yeah.
you're bang on, and people forget. I mean, I'm a huge kind of realist around semiconductors will remain a cyclical business, and not
Mm.
that I think we're anywhere near a tip of the cycle. Like, people can't produce enough of these things still at the moment, but they are physical products too, so you can't just ship at any kind of scale. TSMC's still got huge kind of capacity constraints around, you know, how much to build of each piece, and naturally they'll try and build as much of the new world pieces as they can because that's the highest margin. But they've got relationships to manage at the other end, and they can't kind of let all that fall by the wayside either. So I think staying realistic that these things are cyclical business is important, probably on a over the next few years. And then just remembering that in each given quarter, despite demand being through the roof, they still can only ship so many. So earnings are always a great kind of bring back the sell the news kind of measure. So I'd be kind of happy to own this outside of the earnings periods, and probably try and be a bit lighter going into most of these things. But then you've seen NVIDIA come out time and time again and just kind of when they beat that, that quarter kind of a year ago when they just beat by 50% on the top line, just like a business that size just doesn't happen. So you'd miss some of those big opportunities too, but probably cap some downside.
Yeah, definitely. Um, Another interesting thing on the cyclicality is, I think if you add up all the government subsidies, it comes to 200 billion. So you could see a world where that actually helps drive some oversupply in a couple of years. When you have these enormous government subsidies coming in, it's kind
Mm.
of mitigated by the fact that governments are also building their own data centers now. They want to host, defense and important industries, the AI models like internally on equipment they've like thoroughly inspected that isn't going to an American cloud and hosted in the United States. So there are positives to the government, what the governments are doing around the world, and I think that's actually new. I think the amount that they're spending is really substantial. It's like effectively a massive new customer for NVIDIA, where they might not have been there before. But in any industry, when you have government coming in spending huge subsidies, generally you get oversupply. Certainly a lot more supply than you would have, without that 200 billion of cash, and that's
Oh,
across
definitely.
EU, China, Japan, US.
Yeah, definitely. And I think ultimately cyclicality happens because people build and then pause and then kind of reassess. And those pause moments were the ones that get you. You've also then got, you touched on it earlier, like the China piece. Firstly, that's going to be competition of new players actually coming to the market. And then they're not just going to serve the domestic Chinese market. They will be exporting to the world as they're doing with EVs and crushing that. I mean, I really look at the EV industry as a really good, space of Tesla had such a runway. Where's China just come from? BYD's just taken over Tesla in volumes, and there are about three or four, companies behind them looking at doing, similar kind of specs. And they're coming in and they're just so price competitive. Ultimately, I think the narrative that a Tesla is this ecosystem that drivers love and use is similar to an iPhone. I don't think that's the thing. Cars are ultimately an A to B, and when the price differential is so large, I think there's no amount of kind of ecosystem stickiness that kind of helps you there. And then, I think that because of the China sanctions, you've seen a massive pull forward where they've been over ordering today and, probably still getting away with, circumventing some of those regulations. So how much of the actual supply chain has been over ordering, which eventually normalizes too, is really kind of important. The same thing happened in crypto where everyone was buying GPUs, and then suddenly crypto fell, and they were just flooding the market with second hand. Nobody needed to buy a new GPU for a while, and that's kind of not going to play out again. They've removed all the kind of mining capability from most of their GPUs anyway, but just a good kind of reminder.
Yeah, definitely. I think um, at the moment the demand is still there. So the Microsoft person we were speaking to said, they're opening a data center every 3 days. It takes a while to build, but every 3 days there's a
Mm.
new one opening, and they're at full capacity in 3 to 5 hours. So there is that customer demand where crypto was always, other than, store of wealth and the payment stuff and being a great place for anybody in any troubled zone, whether it's Russia, China, Middle East, to store wealth. People build apps and no one really came.
Yeah, totally. It's really not played out. Yeah, like yeah, and no, none of us really have a daily use case for using it today. And so ultimately, I can see the store of wealth side and understand that. The rest, I think, is probably a lot of smoke.
Yeah, I found it amusing to see in Canada has all these restrictions around bank accounts. When there was trucker protests, they made people hard for people to access their accounts. Now apparently you have to have a reason if you withdraw cash. So you can't necessarily just go into the bank and withdraw all the cash that you have.
It's actually, I mean, I think this is the real kind of own goal that's, driving, really reinforcing this, but of course, you've seen so much like fiber issues, probably like everyone's grandmother's probably been, semi-Nigerian prince at some point. But I think ultimately the banking system as well is, people are really learning now more than ever that you don't just have access to your money. Like you really get questioned whether you're, anything in cash is based, it's almost what India did, where they really tried to kill the cash economy and move everything towards, these payment systems. But even just trying to get anything over a few grand out of the bank account, there's like so much process around it. Moving money internationally is just near impossible. And, this is even back between kind of tier one places like Oz and Hong Kong. It's just, it kind of beggars belief.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that was interesting this week is Eli Lilly came out with a long-awaited study. I'm not sure if you've been following it, but from mid to late last year, there was a huge sell-off in all kinds of medical technology companies, as these GLP-1 drugs or GLP-1 drugs seem to have like an extremely positive effect across the heart, kidney, liver. But one that was particularly widely anticipated was this sleep apnea, which forms the basis of some very large companies, including ResMed in Australia. And they finally released the data, and it kind of showed about 60%, almost two-thirds reduction in sleep apnea amongst obese people. So you've got another large medical condition that these drugs just seem incredibly effective for.
Yeah, I mean I remember watching it because I haven't followed ResMed too closely, but it was kind of big headlines when it hit, so it was like too intriguing not to look at. Sent the share price down, about 30% pretty quickly. I think what you actually then ended up saying, and this is why it's so important, like falling into narratives can be really problematic first up, because actually, they would argue, and I think the recovery of the share price kind of is proving right that actually, sleep apnea, and their thesis generally has been that this is a super underdiagnosed condition. So 20%, these aren't correct numbers, but 20% of the world might have it, but only kind of 2% get diagnosed. And actually what this was doing, so people that wanted to actually get Ozempic and were, suddenly flagging sleep apnea as their excuse, this was actually bringing them first into GPs that would force them to do it, at least do the sleep test. So a short-term tailwind for the stock. And that there's so many kind of flow-on effects of like so many of these pieces, but ultimately I think you're right, like this isn't great for their end market, and if sleep apnea can be treated rather than managed, then they've probably got a longer term issue.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. It's definitely another line of treatment. We often looked at a stock that basically had a surgical treatment for sleep apnea, called Inspire, and it was kind of a pretty good performer, but it got absolutely smacked last year. But then for all those kinds of players are like second, third, fourth line treatment, you've just got another line, just got another thing that people are going to try. So it definitely
Yeah.
does weaken the market, but it's very positive for everybody because, as you say, sleep apnea is very underdiagnosed and is surprisingly correlated with all kinds of negative health consequences.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's just poor sleep, right? Everyone suddenly read Why We Sleep, and suddenly I've got to get my 8 hours. That was almost, it used to be almost bragging rights about how little sleep people, CEOs used to say they got. Now nobody really kind of, I think people just think, hey, poor you, you idiot. So that's
Yeah,
quite
I think there's something fundamental going on. Like if you think about it, every animal that thinks has to sleep. There are no
mm,
exceptions. There's literally no exceptions to that. So why, like evolutionary, that's such a bad thing to have to just knock yourself out and be unconscious for a third of the day. So why do we all do it? Like it must be deeply fundamental to how we think, how our brains work. Obviously, it's been established that it's very useful for memory formation as one thing. So you wonder if maybe like, the large language models in our head that are predicting what we're going to say next and saying it. You wonder if that's like when they're kind of taking their training time to kind of
yeah.
prune the kind of memories and decide what's important, what's not, which neurons strengthen. And there's not enough energy perhaps to kind of do that at the same time. So you have to switch that system over from,
Yeah.
consciousness to training mode.
Cue Elon Musk chip implants in the brain, right? It's just, I mean, the ultimately this like tin hat kind of coming on here, but the real fear is that humans are actually the biggest latency to progress, and we just like we do take 18 years of heavy social conditioning to have it beaten into us, like how to act normal and think. And that I can't see how you can maybe take 10 or 20% off that, but it can't keep up with the rest of the pace of growth. And I'm kind of one of those people who actually think, is growth even good in the first place? But we're on such an unstoppable path. It's certainly it's a worry.
Yeah, well, if you think about how our brains work, they kind of like take a long time to train, but they're incredibly efficient by a factor of like 1,000 versus, a computer.
What's your, I mean, you've got more medical pedigree than I do, but Ozempic and the GLP-1, this just seems like the first time in history that we've had this, wonder drug. I mean, I've always believed and that ultimately, you need some level of self-discipline and things like that to stay healthy, and lifestyle is kind of the biggest impact. But ultimately, you were just suddenly everyone's kind of learning this really bad lesson that actually there's a drug that kind of solves all. Do you think this is going to be this wonder drug, or we just don't know what the kind of 10 and 20-year side effects will be, or maybe other
Look, I
other
think it's
issues
I think it's
behind it?
shown a few things. So there's parts of it that are very well established. The way it slows digestion, the effect on blood sugar, that's all very well established. The stuff on how it affects your brain and why people are drinking less, apparently having babies more, but gambling less, that is less well understood. In terms of like a wonder drug, there were plenty of people that were saying, a lot of diseases are metabolic, right? There's a lot to do with like blood sugar and those blood sugar spikes, and actually that was causing all kinds of trouble. And you can see it, right? You can see it when people are kind of old, overweight, tired, skin's terrible, all kinds of health conditions happening at once. This kind of like is really strong evidence that that is a major part of it, because you're kind of fixing that metabolic side or improving that metabolic side, and then having positive impacts on almost every organ that you can see, right?
Yeah.
There was some promising results in Parkinson's, it's not just kidney, liver, heart, and obviously well. So I think it's an immensely positive thing. I'll say another thing, like if you do the numbers, if you have an extra like mouthful of food every day, you'll be obese by the end of the year. Like the difference between being
Mm.
slim 70, 80 kilograms and being 100, 110, 120 is really narrow when you think about it, if you just look at the numbers. And the reason for that is we all have these internal things that balance everything out. You might go for a very long run, then you might lie on the couch and eat a bit more. Somehow our bodies are like really good at there's this like
Regulating,
level
yeah.
that they tend to maintain, and you're regulating, and it's really powerful effect. And this seems to kind of just readjust that down. So yeah, I'm pretty convinced these are good things. I mean, could there be something, 20 years down the track? These drugs have actually been in the market for decades. So
Mm.
there have been very large 10-year studies which showed all these
Yeah.
health benefits. So the question is there something that turns up at 20 or 30 years? But then you're starting to get to the point, well, if you have better health for 20 or 30 years, it would be a real surprise if something came up that was in any way, not overweighed by those immense health benefits of the 20 or 30 years before.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, it's the homeostasis piece, like the self-regulation. I mean, maybe, with absolutely no scientific kind of backer, it'd be really interesting to see how people come off these drugs as well, and how, if there are any kind of impacts to the kind of rebalanced homeostasis, and, if you're more predisposed to then put on weight, or if they are kind of, once you're on, you kind of need to stay on that path, and you kind of, tied at the hip.
Yeah, well, I think people do just kind of go back to where they were, but that's fine.
Yeah,
It's probably more encouraging
that's
than if
fine.
people
Yeah,
were.
yeah.
There was an interesting article that I think there's something to it, is it obviously changes your personality in some ways.
I was
I've
actually
tried
going to
this
say,
stuff. Yeah,
are you a less interesting kind of funny guy and all that kind of,
you definitely go out a lot less, you drink a lot less, you have less
yeah,
energy for that, less appetite for that kind of thing, which is great if you're trying to have less than 4 beers.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Or like, just go home at 11 instead of 2 a.m. or
yeah.
something.
That's the
That's a positive.
you're living, but
But
on
what
your
if,
knees.
yeah, what if you're on it for 10, 15, 20 years? Like you're clearly going to be a different person at the end of that, having taken all these different decisions along the road. But maybe that's what you want.
Yeah,
Maybe that's all
I
positive
think,
again.
physical health is obviously so important, but I guess you want to be still kind of your own kind of person as well. So I mean, if it turns everyone into like half zombie like, kind of, it's just not going to be a very interesting place to be. So you might be in great condition physically, but you're kind of like not able to kind of like talk to somebody interesting, and kind of attract the right person anyway. So
Interesting. Yeah, I don't think anybody's. I
no,
don't think
this
there's
is
been anything that's
definitely
saying people are
this.
less interesting. And if you had to guess, you'd say you're probably more likely to attract the right person, 10 or 20 kilograms lighter, but who knows? Who knows?
Yeah, as Ozempic singles parties, that'll be the new.
Actually, that sounds pretty boring, doesn't
Yeah,
it?
it does.
Probably prefer to party with the degenerates.
Yeah,
Why don't we wrap up there?
hey, really good fun.